Perhaps the biggest difference for the NFL game this season will come not on offense and not on defense, but on special teams. We're looking at the new kickoff rules and how it impacts the Dolphins specifically here today on Locked On Dolphins.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting. You can find our shows on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Tip of the cap to our everydayers, because it is your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it here on the Locked On Network. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code Locked On NFL for $20 off your first purchase on last-minute tickets, where the lowest prices guaranteed. We heard from each of the Dolphins' three coordinators yesterday at Miami Dolphins minicamp, the third day of practice or work. By the way, has been canceled. The Dolphins doing a walkthrough. Head coach Mike McDaniel apparently pleased with what he got out from a work perspective through his team's first 2 days of mandatory minicamp on Tuesday and Wednesday. They will hold a walkthrough today. And after the session on Wednesday, we heard from Frank Smith, the offensive coordinator. We heard from Anthony Weaver, the new defensive coordinator. And we heard from Danny Crossman, the Dolphins special teams coordinator. And amidst all of the free agency changes and the draft and these contract negotiations for the Dolphins amidst the AFC East and the AFC landscape as a whole, we've kind of just floated by the fact that the NFL has reinvented the kickoff off of the backs of the XFL kickoff rules that came into place this past year in 2023 when the XFL was back, and with great success. The kickoff rules it gives a totally different feel to that play. About 1 in every 5 kickoffs in the NFL last season was returned. So 8 out of 10, I'm not a math guy, but I could do 1 out of 5 to 2 out of 10, is a waste of time. They just booted out of the back of the end zone for a touchback. And the rules that have been adopted are made in the name of player safety, but also incentivizing teams to return kicks. So Danny Crossman talked a little bit about that. And I want to credit Omar Kelly because I heard his voice on the video that the Dolphins released that we're going to share a couple clips of. And Omar was pretty present in the conversation and asking questions, and got some good stuff from Danny Crossman from a perspective. So I want to first let Danny Crossman share his insight as far as the change to the kickoff. And then we'll get into specifically what the rule is and how it looks. I got a diagram if you're watching on YouTube. So if you're not, we'll talk through all the rules as per the NFL operations page anyway. But here's Danny Crossman, a little bit about the new kickoff rules in general.
Oh, it's been fun. There's so many different avenues and aspects you look at, and some things you think you're really going to like, and then by the time you get out on the field and start looking at it, you're like, what was I ever thinking? And then there's things that maybe you didn't like, and then once you're out there and you're executing and you're seeing it live, you're like, maybe that's something we want to build on. But to me, the main part of this play is really two things. Number one, it is going to be a play that starts unlike any play has ever started. It starts with the ball either being caught or the ball hitting the ground. As opposed to every other play, it's either the snap or what we're all used to, the ball being kicked. So that's a completely different animal. Secondly, the space aspect, completely different. However, once all that stuff, you take all that out, you're still doing the same thing. It's still blocking, getting off of blocks and tackling. However, that space differential may enable to use and maybe look at some different players.
So let's get into the kickoff rules in general. And I think it is a dramatic change. The kicker will, like he has in regular kickoffs or old school kickoffs, kick the ball off from the kicking team's 35-yard line. The other 10 players on the kicking team are lining up on the plus 40 now. So they are on the other side of the 50 at the 40-yard line, and they are not allowed to move until the ball either hits the ground or is caught by the receiving team. The receiving team must have at least 9 players between their own 35 and 30-yard lines. So these two units, instead of being separated by 10 yards, some 60 yards potentially away from where the ball is caught, they are now separated by 5 yards, sometimes 10 yards, but at most 10 yards and at least 5 yards. And these collisions are going to be happening on the receiving team's 35 to 30-yard line now, as compared to obviously the big difference with all of this happening much further away. This reduces the space, reduces the time in which players can build up and lead to contact. There's less running starts. Obviously, that was a change that was kind of made in the process to them transitioning away from this. The other 2 players for the receiving team can line up anywhere. You can line them up wherever you want. But the ball, objectively, from the kicking side, must land at least inside the 20-yard line. If the ball is kicked and it goes out of bounds, like it did before, it goes to the plus 40 or the minus 40, for the receiving team. If the ball lands short of the 20-yard line, it also goes to the 40. So you can't just loop this thing into the 22-yard line. If it hits the ground outside the 20-yard line, it's a dead play and it goes to the 40. Period. That's it. If it lands inside the landing zone, which is from the 20 to the goal line, if the ball is landing in that area, it must be returned. And obviously, wherever that return stops is where the ball will be marked for the offense to come onto the field and start their next possession. If the ball lands in the landing zone and rolls into the end zone, that can be returned, but it can also be down for a touchback, and that will go to the 20-yard line. If the kick lands in the end zone and is down for a touchback, it goes to the 30-yard line. If the ball is kicked out of the back of the end zone, it also goes to the 30-yard line. So you're potentially starting at the 20, the 30, the 40, or wherever the kick return ends. This is obviously a very different format from what you're used to with bombing the kick down and having all of that speed, and things are spaced out differently. And Danny Crossman alluded to that. The spacing is totally different. Now, the mechanics of the play are still fundamentally the same, but this almost has a little bit more of an offensive play type of feel. And from a kicking or receiving team perspective, Crossman alluded to kind of the chess piece that is the 10th player. You have to have 9 players at least between the 35 and the 30. Do you put 2 returners back there? How do you play those returners off of each other? Knowing that if the ball lands in a 20-yard strike zone, the ball has to be returned. Some teams apparently are weighing out having a position player kick some of those balls off, because that way you get an extra coverage player for the return game element of things. Some teams may just opt to play the special teams game and say, or the field position game and say, hey, we'll give you the extra 10 yards of field position and not risk the explosive plays. And that's where, for a lot of Dolphins fans, the intrigue comes in. Oh, Dolphins got a lot of speed. They got a lot of guys with a lot of experience, whether in college or the pros, returning kicks and punts. What does that mean? What does that mean for Miami? So we're going to shift here and look at kind of what the Dolphins have been able to do in the kicking game over the past couple of seasons. It has not been good. I know Danny Crossman is a kind of maligned figure within this coaching staff for some of the shortcomings for this team. There's been some inopportune moments over the past 2-3 years. We'll get into some of that. We'll get into who has been returning kicks for the Dolphins the past couple years, including some players that maybe you would think would make sense for the Dolphins to have back there this year. We're going to get into all that next year on Locked On Dolphins. Stick with us. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is sponsored by BetterHelp. Sometimes you need the opportunity to get something off of your chest, big or small. Certain things can really weigh on you, and it's important to get those things out, especially to somebody who is unbiased in your life. Therapy can be different for everyone. Most of us have bigger problems than who's going to be back there returning kicks, or if you kick the ball off, or if you choose to just put it out of the back of the end zone and give up the extra 10 yards of field position. That's what Danny Crossman's wondering right now. But you have your own battles in life. And if you're thinking of starting therapy, you can give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be flexible, suited to your schedule. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon and save 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. I hope you guys are watching on YouTube. I'm proud of that little diagram that I made. That was courtesy of Canva. Get a football field diagram, put the X's on there at the 40-yard line, the kicker from the 35. One of the note with the kickoff rules, penalties that are incurred on a scoring play or whatever that would be enforced on the kickoff, that does not change where the teams line up. It only changes where the ball is marked to kick from. And same for safeties. Like a safety would be kicked from the 20 instead of the 35. But opposing teams are still lining up on the 40 and between the 35 and 30 on the receiving team side of the 50. So it's been a nice little 20 minutes making that today. Was fired up. Like, you guys like your visual aids. You hate coming on here and looking at my mug for 25 minutes. I can't say I blame you. But as much as you think my ugly mug might take the wind out of your sails, we're going to talk about the Dolphins' past 3 years of kickoff return history. 2021, the primary returner was Jalen Waddle, the new $28 million a year player. Tyreek Hill said his new nickname for Waddle is 28, right? And Waddle, his rookie season, comes in addition to setting the rookie record for receptions, was the team's primary kick returner. And he averaged 17 yards per return on kickoffs. Okay, it's pretty paltry. Then Mike McDaniel comes in, and Raheem Mostert, as a free agent, not really established as the primary ball carrier. There was some question whether it was going to be him or Chase Edmonds, who they gave a big contract to. He was coming off of an injury. He'd done it in the past when he was kind of a rotational back. He was the primary return man on kickoffs for the Dolphins in 2022. And the good news was his yards per return went up 3 yards from the previous season. When Jalen Waddle did it, he averaged 20 yards per return. Still not great numbers, especially if you're considering most of these that are returned are landing just short of the end zone. So you probably have to return them. So you're getting about the same place that you would anyway, right? Braxton Berrios, your primary returner in 2023. Obviously, they paid him to be a return player in addition to his role as a slot receiver. And he averaged 24 yards per return on 33 returns this past season. So it's 33. I have 33 written down. 33 is the longest kickoff return the Dolphins have had in the last 3 years is 33 yards by Braxton Berrios. So that's why I have 33 written down. So consider that. I believe there's been 2 kickoff returns for the Dolphins in the past 3 seasons that have been longer than 30 yards. One was 31 by Raheem Mostert, the other 33 by Braxton Berrios this past year. That's it. I mean, that's contributions there are not great, right? But it gets even uglier when you foil the Dolphins kickoff return unit versus their kickoff coverage unit. In 2021, opponents averaged 3 yards more per return than the Dolphins. And this is in spite of the fact, mind you, that remember, as I give you these numbers, the Dolphins' yards per return went up 3 and then 4 yards over a 3-year sample size. 3 yards, minus 3 yards in 2021. In 2022, they were minus 9 yards per return. And granted, they had the big kickoff return for a touchdown by the Ravens in that week 2 game. That obviously juiced that figure to open that football game. But nevertheless, minus 9 yards in opponent return differential versus their own kickoff return units. And in 2023, they were minus 6 yards in opponent return differential. So they have not outgained across a season their opponent in yards per return for the last 3 seasons. They've had 0 touchdown returns over that stretch of time and have conceded 3 touchdowns on kick and punt returns by opponents over that stretch of time. So again, we've alluded to Danny Crossman being a little bit of a maligned personality for the Dolphins, and these figures are not great. I do think there is some context. Mike McDaniel certainly feels there's some context in talking about the decision this offseason to retain Danny Crossman. Obviously, the big black eye for the Dolphins last year was the Week 18 game where a guy blows out his patella and is in the hole where the punt return ends up going late in that game in Week 18 for a touchdown. That's a deciding factor in that football game that had so much on the line. So some unfortunate circumstances there for sure. Certainly, you consider who the Dolphins have had pegged as special teams type players and whether or not they've been in those roles full time or they've been elevated and had to play other roles on the offense or defense because of injuries. But nobody cares about injuries as an excuse, right? At the end of the day, you still have to go out and execute. I think that's fair, but I think if you're reading between the lines as far as why the Dolphins have made the decision to have some level of continuity, Mike McDaniel talked about the teaching style of Danny Crossman. And I think if you look beyond the surface level of the raw production, you understand, hey, we kind of need some more specialists on this team. And it's getting into a 53-man roster cut, right? There's this weird intersection of offensive coaches want their guys, defensive coaches want their guys, special teams coach wants his guys. The general manager is probably going to want a couple of young guys that have flashed a little bit in the preseason, but they're probably not really ready to play. Maybe they're not experienced in playing special teams. So that's all the numbers game of getting down to 53 guys that makes it a real big challenge. But these kickoff rules, as they have been adjusted to facilitate and encourage kickoff returns, you're either going to punt on an extra first down's worth of field position, or you're going to kick and it's going to get returned. And the strategic elements of this are dramatically different than what it has been. And you saw that in the XFL. There's been some really cool play designs for how to utilize kickoff returns. There's a lot of brainstorming that's going on across the league as far as how to optimize these rules and these opportunities. And Danny Crossman talked a little bit about that as far as who's fitting on kickoff and who's fitting on kickoff return. We're going to get into that, as well as my opinions on who I think are the best options on the Dolphins roster to return kickoffs next here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. Make sure you stick with us. Going to the game's not supposed to be stressful, especially this weekend. We have the Florida Panthers playing in the Stanley Cup Final. If you want to happen upon some last-minute tickets, make sure you get them from Game Time. Game Time can save you up to 60% off buying last-minute tickets for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, and more. With flash deals and zone deals, you could save even more, and they have all-in pricing, so there's no surprises when you go to check out and put the tickets into your cart, and then all of a sudden it's 3x the price. Not with Game Time. You know exactly what you're signing up for when you choose to commit to a pair of tickets. Just a few taps, you can get your tickets delivered directly to your phone. And they have the panoramic view, so you know what your sight lines are from your seat before you hit purchase and buy. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDONNFL. For $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. So Danny Crossman asked about who do you want on these units with these new rules? And he gave some insight. We'll hear what he had to say, courtesy of the Miami Dolphins and their social team and their YouTube channel. And then we'll kind of look at what the Dolphins have on the roster this year, some guys that they've added, and then get into, hey, who should be returning kicks, which is obviously the hallmark figure because that's the guy that touches the football.
Well, ideally, your blockers are athletes, or your athletes are good blockers. But it's a combination of, are we saying, could it be offensive linemen? Yeah. Could it be tight ends? Yeah. Could it be linebackers? Yeah. So I think you're going to have the numbers of eligible players that we have hasn't changed. We're still going to have the same active list. So you still are working off the same nucleus of These are the only bodies you have. But I do think that some of the aspects of the play may enable some guys that haven't been part of the play now to become part of the play.
It's really interesting to consider offensive linemen on the kickoff return team, right? But I think that thing that he led with was ideally your athletes, your blockers are athletes, and your athletes are good blockers. And that's where you kind of get into some of the same positions that have always been a part of the mix, whether they're linebackers or tight ends or safeties or guys with some length, some deeper in the depth chart wide receivers and backs and fullbacks. Um, and that's where I think Miami has a lot of numbers for options. Now, could you see them implementing a few offensive linemen to kind of serve as an accentuation point for the blocking surface for the return game? Yeah, I think so. Especially considering the player that is receiving the ball could at times be as little as 10 to 15 yards behind where the blocking is starting, and nobody can move until the ball is caught or fielded or the ball hits the ground. So, how teams handle the kicking element of it could potentially make sense where on any given week, I think you're going to have more turnover in strategy and not just have a blanket strategy of who's going to be out there on the kickoff team. Because as teams kind of show their hand, hey, they like to kick it on the end line or into the end zone. There's a little bit more space. Maybe you want guys with a little bit more three-dimensional range. Hey, this team likes to kick it short and try and compress you quickly. Let's get some offensive line. Let's get an athletic offensive lineman or two out there that makes a lot of sense. And we can utilize their grip strength to really kind of set a wall or set an area for where we want to try and hit a return. So when you look at what the Dolphins have, I think the tight end room in general, obviously you have Giannu Smith. Durham Smythe, I think, is a candidate to play special teams. I don't think that's somebody that you would omit from playing on special teams, but this offense in general is about angles and blocking in space, particularly as a tight end. This is not, hey, we got the road grader inline tight end type who's just going to put his hand in the dirt and he's going to maul defensive ends down on double teams. That's not really how they block, right? It does require some blocking in space. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think you could expand that to Julian Hill. I think you could certainly expand that to Jody Fortson. I think you could expand that to Tanner Connor. I think Jonnu Smith's probably the only tight end on the roster that'd say, I want to save your reps for offense. Right. I think at Alec Ingold into this mix makes a lot of sense as well. Chris Brooks has an opportunity as a bigger bodied guy, but an athletic guy, especially when it's no longer, hey, we want you to run all the way down the field. Right. Everything's a little bit more compact now. Your long speed's a little less impactful if you take good angles. That's a player that I think makes some sense. Eric Ezukanma, potentially. I know size at wide receiver is a critique for a lot for this team, so I don't think there's too many in that room, but I think the tight ends can certainly make up for it quite a bit. But then you go to the defensive side of the ball. This team signed Saron Neal, who was a career teams player in Buffalo. I think that's a player. This could be a core 4 special teams player for you. I think that's a lock. I think Cam Brown, who was a late free agent signing, I know all of the rave reviews that came out from him from training camp talked about his length and his technique. Well, if you got block deconstruction skills and length and you can run, I got good news for you. The kickoff coverage team is going to be a place for you to be. And potentially, if you got length and you can run the feet, and you got good hand strength, maybe on kickoff return too. So I think Cam Brown, I think Saron Neal, I think Elijah Campbell, I think guys like that, in addition to Smythe, Hill, Ingold, Fortson, that's where if Danny Crossman's to believed in saying, ideally, your blockers are athletes and your athletes are good blockers, those traditional players, I actually think Miami has a little bit more depth now than they have had in years past with guys who are career teams players. And I feel like that's maybe betrayed them a little bit in the past few years. I think you can look at the edge group as well. And when everybody's healthy, If you told me that there's going to be some reps and opportunities for Cameron Good to be back out there, I'd believe you for sure. Chop Robinson, I think maybe ideally you wouldn't be burning your special team, your first round pick on kickoff plays, but this is a more high impact play now. So I think the value of this is boosted, and that's why we're doing a show on it here in the first week in June. I think Quentin Bell may be a candidate. I think Ethan Bonner as a corner who has some physicality. They've got options. And I think that they actually have a breadth of pretty good options. And that's without getting into, do you want heavy-handed guys and offensive linemen out there? But who should be returning kicks? That's the big question. Because Miami has Tyreek Hill on their roster. They have Jalen Waddle on their roster. They have Devon Achane on their roster. They have a guy in Braxton Berrios who was the returner last year, who was pegged as the returner, and they chose to bring back. They have another 4-3 guy in Anthony Schwartz. They had Javon Holland did punts and a few kickoffs. Raheem Mostert's done it. Most of these guys can fly. Who should be doing it? I think with Tyreek Hill's workload offensively, probably not, and especially not on the punt team, right? And the focus right now is the kickoff in particular. And the objectives from a player safety standpoint, this format is supposed to take out high impact collisions, reduce concussions, all that kind of stuff. I just think with how central Tyreek Hill right now is to what the Dolphins do offensively, I probably wouldn't go that route. I think at running back, you have a little bit more depth. Raheem Mostert's your primary ball carrier. I think Devon Achane's a no-brainer to be back there because that's a player, even at his stature, right? And he did kickoffs and punts in college, and he ripped off a 96-yarder against Alabama. He tied a game against App State. So he's got a couple kickoff return touchdowns on his resume, college at Texas A&M. I think Achane, with his stature, even as a guy who's filled out his frame a little bit, that's a player who I think you're not really gonna see him get into a 20+ touches per game type role with any level of consistency. And I think that's evidenced by the fact that Achane, they're talking about adding more to his menu to be more of a passing game presence as well. And then you have the special teams element for him. And if the high impact stuff's out of the game, we're a little less worried about him getting absolutely lit up by a guy who's running from the other side of the 50-yard line on kickoff returns. That might be a first-class ticket, I think, to maximizing his skill set by getting him another 5 or 6 touches a game, courtesy of, I guess ideally you'd be getting 1 touch a game, right? Ideally, you're not giving up any points. But if you're getting 3-4 kickoff returns a game, and those are now touches that are encouraged to be returned as compared to encouraged to kick it out of the back of the end zone and not play games with the return team. Stealing 3-4 extra touches for Achane as a player who maybe gets 12 carries, maybe gets a handful of receptions. Maybe you could get him to 20, but it's not all workload from lining him up and running him up the gut as a ball carrier. I think Achane's a no-brainer. I think that player makes a ton of sense for the Dolphins to get the most out of. And the Dolphins have kind of told you, hey, we want to have depth at that position with trading a 3rd-round pick in 2025 to get a 4 for Jalen Wright, in addition to Raheem Mostert, who they gave a contract extension to, and they used a 3rd-round pick last year in Devon Achane in the first place. Remember when people thought we didn't care about the running back position? So Devon Achane is one. I think the other player, it'll be really interesting to see, do teams kind of de facto have 2 return guys and try to cut the field in half and have less of a blocker? Do they have a second player who their chess piece player is a blocker that can kind of serve as a lead blocker based off their blocking surfaces? If they want to have 2 return guys back, I guess I would probably go Maybe if you want speed, if you're addicted to the speed element of it, maybe that's an in way for a guy like Anthony Schwartz to crack the top 6, 7 wide receivers, depending on how many they carry. Look, Jalen Waddle, kickoff return against Auburn, punt return against LSU in 2019. I was at that game. My jaw was on the floor. He had his face mask ripped off. He was turned backwards the other way. One of the single individual, like in my career, from a college scouting perspective, one of the single best individual plays I've seen was Jalen Waddle on that punt return against LSU. He can do it. And he can return kicks. So Waddle, maybe. I think if you want to get really greedy, it'd be just very easy to say, hey, take your 2 superstar wide receivers and put them back there and turn it into track meet. But I think Devon Achane is the player, when you look at the depth chart, who makes the most sense to maximize, and you're incentivized to get him a few extra touches. And then my strategy on it would at times almost want Alec Ingold to be that other player that you can line up anywhere, who's not restricted by he needs to be between the 35 and the 30-yard line. You can line him up anywhere and then just have Achane back there to be the primary fielder, and then have a personal protector for him and Ingold to kind of move around and line him up in tandem. Because it's not like you're going to kick it. If it goes out of bounds, you're going to the 40-yard line. So it's not like teams can just kind of rope it down there. If teams kick it short of the 20, it goes to the 40-yard line. So you can't squib kick it, right? So anything that you do that you're trying to loft angular-wise, I would be inclined to think like a single player with his feet on the 10-yard line could get to, based off the trajectory of how you have to kick it. And then from there, you could set up your return. Achane's the guy I would want back there, is what I'm trying to say. Who knew you'd get 32 minutes of kickoff talk here on Locked On Dolphins on a Thursday in June? But you did. Never know. Never underestimate. Special teams. What is it? Special teams, special players, special plays. Is that how that kid says it? Yeah, this is going to be really interesting to see how it all unfolds. And we'll be here every step of the way, all season long, all off season long. And we'll see if the Dolphins bring anybody else in that might make some sense to be a part of these kind of central pieces of these new kickoff rules as well. That's going to do it for me here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day. I appreciate you guys checking out the show. Make it a great rest of your day. Fins up. I am out of here.